Chapter 2, Moonshine Madness. In the early days, the maker of illegal spirits became known as a moonshiner because he preferred to make whiskey on a clear night with a full moon so there was enough light to see what he was doing, yet dark enough to make it difficult for revenuers to find him. Many colorful names have been used for moonshine, such as blockade whiskey, white lightning, corn squeezins, white mule, pure corn, and firewater. A few years after the Revolutionary War in 1791, the U.S. Congress passed a law which, for the first time in American history, imposed a whiskey tax of 7 cents on each gallon made. Many citizens intensely opposed this law, including the Scotch-Irish settlers of western Pennsylvania. They rebelled, refused to pay the tax, and organized a large contingent of men to defend what they thought was their God-given right to make whiskey. In 1794, several thousand federal troops marched into western Pennsylvania and put down this whiskey rebellion. The defeat caused many northern whiskey makers to migrate south into Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, where they could easily hide from revenuers. Soon, almost every farm in Kentucky and Tennessee had a still. One report said by 1799 there were less than 4,000 people, but 61 stills in Davidson County, Tennessee. 8 years later, on June 30th, 1802, newly elected President Thomas Jefferson did away with the tax on spirits. For a period of 60 years, from 1802 to 1862, making whiskey was legal, with no tax required, except for 3 years following the War of 1812. By 1819, New Orleans was receiving over 2 million gallons of whiskey per year from upriver in Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. At this time, Tennessee was producing an estimated 800,000 gallons a year from small stills. In 1862, Congress was in desperate need of money to pay for the Civil War and imposed a tax on distilled spirits. In order to enforce compliance, Congress also established the Office of Internal Revenue. This tax rose from 18 cents per gallon in 1863 to $2 per gallon 2 years later in 1865. From 1862 to 1909, it was legal to make whiskey in Tennessee if the whiskey tax was paid. After the Civil War, there were hundreds of legal regulated distilleries in Appalachian states, including Tennessee. Government inspectors came in every month at an appointed time and inspected the mash, the supplies, and the whiskey. They also checked the books to make sure the operator was paying the proper amount of tax. These inspectors were also called gaugers. However, many of these government stills were operated legally by day and shifted to illegal operations after dark. In 1877, a report by the Commission of Internal Revenue stated, "I can safely say that during the past year, no less than 3,000 illicit stills have been operating in the district named Southeastern Mountain Districts. These stills are producing 10 to 50 gallons a day. They're usually located in inaccessible points in the mountains and are generally owned by unlettered men of desperate character who are armed and ready to resist the officers of the law. When occasion requires, they come together in companies numbered from 10 to 50 people, guns in hand to drive the officers out of the country." In the early 1900s, preachers and their congregations began organizing and calling for an outright ban of all evil spirits. Individual states were allowed to enact their own laws, outlawing the sale of whiskey. Georgia outlawed manufacture and sale in 1907. Alabama, Mississippi, and North Carolina in 1908, Tennessee in 1909, Virginia in 1914, and West Virginia in 1917. However, all of these states were said to vote dry and drink wet. Will Rogers was quoted as stating, "If you think this country ain't dry, just watch 'em vote. If you think this country ain't wet, just watch 'em drink." You see, when they vote, it's counted, but when they drink, it ain't. The coalition of churches eventually won the fight. National prohibition making it illegal to manufacture or sell whiskey was passed in 1919 and took effect on January 17, 1920. In his book, Joseph Dabney said, at 12:01 a.m. on January the 17th, Protestant church bells rang across America, celebrating the beginning of Prohibition. In Norfolk, Virginia, an appropriate funeral service was held for John Barleycorn, a fictitious name for the evil spirits, and 10,000 mourners turned out to hear evangelist Billy Sunday give the old boy a final send-off. Old Demon Rum, it appeared, was being put to rest from shore to shore, never to again rise. The victim's body, encased in a 20-foot casket, was drawn by horses and accompanied by 20 jovial pallbearers. In the pulpit, Billy Sunday danced a jig and preached a rip-roaring funeral sermon in honor of America's collective climb aboard the water wagon. "Goodbye, John," Sunday intoned. "You were God's worst enemy. You were hell's best friend. The reign of terror is over. The slums will only soon be a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs. Men will walk upright now. Women will smile. Children will laugh. Hell will be forever for rent." Billy Sunday's predictions did not turn out the way he envisioned them. The director of the Prohibition Enforcement Bureau established his agents, captured and destroyed 172,537 stills during the year of 1925 alone. But for every still seized, he estimated 9 remained undiscovered. The whiskey retail black market, to a large degree, was controlled by gangsters who operated mainly in the larger cities. Prohibition caused the price to increase and the quality to greatly deteriorate. For example, 60 people died in New York City in 1928 from drinking wood alcohol. In 1930, the Prohibition Bureau estimated more than 15,000 people had been paralyzed by drinking a cheap alcohol concoction called Jake. By the early 1930s, the majority of citizens realized Prohibition was not working. The demand was too overwhelming. Arguments against Prohibition held that people were going to drink whether it was legal or illegal. The deterioration in quality was injuring and killing many lower-class citizens. And Prohibition was making criminals out of many otherwise decent citizens. An official of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms later indicated, "The Prohibition years were the beginning of an era when people learned to have disrespect for the law. We as a nation haven't recovered from it to this day, and I don't think we ever will." On December the 5th, 1933, ratification of the 21st Amendment officially ended 14 years of national prohibition. Even though national prohibition was abandoned in 1933, individual states and counties had the option to stay dry or to vote to legalize the making and selling of whiskey. Following Prohibition, only 3 counties in Tennessee have elected to legalize the manufacturing of whiskey, each by a single large distillery. For example, Jack Daniels started making legal whiskey in Lynchburg in 1866 and continues there until Tennessee voted to become dry in 1909, which time they moved their distillery operation to St. Louis, Missouri. Mr. Daniels reopened his distillery in Lynchburg in 1938, and whiskey's been made there ever since. It's been illegal to make or sell whiskey in Bledsoe County for nearly 100 years, from 1909 to the present day. The men in the field who were assigned the task of enforcing the compliance with Prohibition and the liquor tax became known as revenuers. The revenuer's toughest job was breaking his area's iron curtain of secrecy. Practically everyone in the mountains either made whiskey or sympathized with or feared those that did. Few dared to become an informer for fear of having their stock slaughtered or their barn and home burned. A snitch was treated with contempt and disapproval. Some suspected informers even lost their lives. One technique a revenuer used to locate stills was to ride horseback and notice whether his horse would drink from the streams they crossed. Horses won't drink from a stream containing still slop. If his horses refused to drink from a stream, a still was likely upstream. Revenuers could detect the smell of a still and were always on the lookout for smoke coming from a still. The moonshiner's most important task was making whiskey, but a close second proximity or priority was avoiding the detection. One moonshiner said, "If you make a path, It's just like pouring paint up through the woods. We'd take our sugar and barley malt, our meal and yeast in a truck, but that truck never left the road. We'd pull out big 2x10 timbers, lay them from the truck to the high bank up in the woods, and then we left no tracks on the banks. Then nobody could tell where our path was. We always walked to the still by a different direction. We'd go up this way today, 10 feet over the next day. One moonshiner said he liked to keep a mule at his still and kept a sharp eye on his ears. If the mule detected a stranger within a half a mile, he'd flick his ears forward like a pointer dog. In his book, Joseph Dabney said the early moonshiner chose his site with great care. The first requirement was a good stream of cool water, preferably soft water, free of minerals such as iron, which will ruin a run of liquor. Next was the requirement of seclusion, where no one ever traveled or thought of traveling. Naturally, that would be a considerable distance into the mountains, away from any inhabited neighborhood. Usually, the site was in a deep holler, covered on both sides with a heavy growth of mountain laurel or timber, with hills high enough so that the smoke would be absorbed by the atmosphere before it reached the summit. The small moonshiner was usually a decent citizen who was soundly convinced that the law was unjust and he was only exercising his natural-born rights. One moonshiner was quoted as saying, "Making liquor's hard work. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy. You rawhide them 100-pound sacks of sugar and then big buckets of mash and all that stuff and cleaning out stills and bottling that stuff and carrying it miles out of the hills on your back. It's rough. You earn every dime you make." Another old-timer said, "Ain't no lazy man gonna make no whiskey. A lot of women says he's too lazy to work. All he does is make whiskey. They ought to try it sometime. They think it's a snap. Carry the sugar down the mountains, and it's wet and it's slippery, and you're falling and a-stumbling and getting down there a-chopping wood, and it wet and trying to get a fire started and don't know whether you're going to run into the revenue or not. And then you have to pack that stuff, the whiskey, back out of the mountains. It's a bloomin' job." "So why do you do it?" another distiller answered. "Moonshining gets in your blood just like sawmilling, digging for gold. Once a gold digger, always a gold digger. Once a moonshiner, always a moonshiner at heart." Over the years, there have been many variations in the ingredients, the process, the hardware of distilling moonshine. Prior to the Prohibition years of the 20s, moonshine was normally made in copper pot stills with a long, drawn-out singling and doubling process by using corn and no sugar. This product was called pure corn. The 50-gallon thumper keg was invented around 1905, which eliminated the time-consuming second distilling step. A larger steamer still was also used by some moonshiners to further increase their production. The big revolution in making moonshine came in the 20s, with the discovery that sugar could be substituted for most of the grain meal, which reduced the production time by 3/4. Using cornmeal and no sugar, the moonshiner could only make about 1 gallon of whiskey from each bushel of corn. With sugar, the method of distilling underwent a vast transformation to speed up and boost the volume of production. For only 500 pounds of sugar costing $50 and 10 bushels of cornmeal, the moonshiner could make 50 gallons of high-proof whiskey in less time and sold it for about $1,000 to $2,000. Most of the corn whiskey made in the mountains of East Tennessee was very strong and high-proof. One resident of the area said a mountain man likes his coffee strong enough to float an iron wedge, and his liquor strong enough to make a rabbit spit in a bulldog's face. Another person advised his friends when drinking corn whiskey, always do so sitting flat on the floor so you won't have so far to fall. The historic picture of this liquor business isn't complete without a look at the player that performed a function that extends into one of today's most popular sports. And that's the role of the tripper. It was the hauler, or transporter, of illegal white line from out of the hills to the consumers in larger cities. Of all the people with a hand in the illicit whiskey business enterprise, the bootlegger, the financier, the master distiller, the still hand. It was the tripper who took the greatest gambles and constant risks and faced the likely possibility of being sent to the federal prison. The true tripper's phenomenon came with the trauma of national prohibition. Before that, most consumers went to the stills or close to them in simple country stores. Jack Daniels got his start making whiskey and selling it in his uncle's country store near Lynchburg. The big city demand and the arrival of fast cars occurred at about the same time, and the speed demon tripper's day finally arrived. Along with the many risks came big money for the tripper. Stories are told throughout Appalachia of them becoming wealthy and switching over to legal, legitimate businesses after their tripping careers ended. A tombstone in Dawsonville, Georgia, is erected over the grave of a man who was not only a wealthy tripper, but also a national stock car champion. His monument includes a carving of the 1939 Ford coupe he used as a very successful tripper. This key aspect of the moonshine business eventually led to the all-important NASCAR, as we know it today. Within another decade or so, the gentle art of illicit whiskey making will be only a piece of history, recounted in the folklore and the stories of old-timers. Within the hills, valleys, and mountains surrounding the Sequatchie Valley, we can only imagine the smell of the mash tubs in the springtime, mingled with the scent of sassafras, dogwood blooms, and the ever-constant odor of leaf mold. But wherever good whiskey and good times are appreciated, the memory of the pure corn, copper pot craftsman will live on. The source for much of the information contained in this chapter was an excellent book published in 1974 by Joseph Earl Dabney entitled Mountain Spirits. Dabney interviewed numerous older moonshiners, trippers, and revenue agents who worked in the mountains of Appalachia from 1900s to the 1960s. A large portion of his book quotes the many humorous and fascinating stories that men told.